Hi, my name is Steve Rahi. I am a Premier Field Engineer specializing in System Center technologies. Today's discussion will be part 6 of an ongoing series focusing on software updates in ConfigMgr 2012. Today's discussion will specifically focus on monitoring software updates. So the question is, why monitor software updates? Well, certainly that's a part of every ConfigMgr administrator's job, especially when it comes to deploying software updates, right? But there are some things that can impact how monitoring is understood. There are some things about monitoring that perhaps may not be as clearly understood as it would be benefited to. So this session will walk through understanding the kinds of things that can impact compliance, what compliance means, and how best to report on it, right? How best to view it. So here's the agenda. First thing I want to do is talk about compliance accuracy and some of the things that can impact compliance accuracy. Then I want to turn and talk about the sources of software update tracking and compliance information that we have available to us. And then talk about reports that are focused on software updates. And then finally, touch on a monitoring toolkit tool that is useful for monitoring software updates and so on. Right? Okay, so in terms of compliance accuracy, I've really broken this down into two buckets. The first is site maintenance, and the other is deployment targeting. The other is deployment targeting. So on the site maintenance bucket, what we're really referring to here is the fact that if you have a site that is not properly maintained, it can and often will lead to you having compliance results that are less than what you would expect. Okay, so what does that mean, right? Well, when we talk about managing an environment, let me go ahead and pull in my environment. I'll talk about deployment targeting too. Whenever we talk about managing an environment, there will be a number of systems that could show up under your devices as inactive. Now, all three of mine are active, but it's very possible you might have some systems in your database that are marked inactive, right? Well, why do inactive systems have an impact on your compliance numbers? Well, I'll explain that going forward, but suffice it to say right now, having inactive systems in your environment or systems that inactive could be systems that are maybe offline for a person being on vacation, or they're old systems that have been around but they don't physically exist anymore. Number of reasons for inactive. Having those systems in your database in an unmanaged state is only bad news for compliance results, right? In some cases. Again, we'll explain it going forward. So understanding what systems you have in your database, whether inactive is really an indicator of a really old system or just one that's temporarily offline, whatever, client issue, whatever the case, it's a good thing to know what's going on. And we give you a lot of tools to help with that, right? So one of the tools is just right down here on every client. So if we look, for example, at my primary site, it should be active because it's a primary site server. We should be getting policy requests from systems by default once an hour. We should be getting heartbeat discovery records at least once a week by default. Hardware data, different things, right? If you have a system that is showing inactive and its last time to be contacting the site is months ago, I would immediately suspect either that system is gone from the environment but still hanging around, or it's a defunct client, right? Well, how do we figure some of those things out? Well, let's talk about some of the tools we have in our tool belt as administrators that can be brought to bear on such questions. And this is definitely not just a software updates discussion, though it's pivotal for software updates and monitoring compliance results, getting the best that you can, and so on. So if we go under sites, we have a series of site maintenance tasks. Well, there's two in this list that really impact keeping our database purged of systems that are older, right? So the default way that these tasks are lined out, I really prefer would be different. We'll discuss that. So the first one that is enabled by default is this thing called delete aged discovery data right here, right? It's enabled by default, set to run once a week, and purge out systems that have not been discovered in the last 90 days, right? Well, first comment about this is in many environments, 90 days is probably a threshold that might be a little bit too long. You'll have to decide for yourself what the threshold is. I don't prefer keeping systems around for 90 days. My mind is around getting systems out that we know are inactive as quickly as possible, or older systems as quickly as possible. So I set this down as much as I can. I don't go below 14 days, right? Because another part of the discussion with active or inactive systems is you want to have time to make a judgment. Is this a system that should be in the environment? It's just a broken client for some reason. Or is it a system that should be purged, right? You want to have time to remediate that, make judgments on it, and take action on it before we just purge the system from the database. So I like 14 days. All right, we'll come back to this in just a minute. The other maintenance task that is available is this one down here called delete inactive client discovery. And notice it's set to no. This one should be default to yes, I believe. And you'll notice the same threshold, same frequency, right? So what's the difference? So to understand the difference, right, is understanding kind of the phrasing here. So how does a client get flagged as inactive? What's the way that this happens? The way this happens, it really is dependent upon discovery data, meaning heartbeat discovery. Heartbeat discovery is the only discovery method that will actively send data from the client to say, I'm around, I'm here, right? Every other discovery method is originated by the site server. Heartbeat discovery data is originated by the client. So if we have a system that's inactive, it is only because we have not received discovery data. Or there's other things in 2012. If we haven't received a policy request or different of those things you saw on the previous screen, then it can be inactive, right? But this is important to understand because all of that data is client initiated. So it's a very good threshold to be able to understand if a client is truly broken, defunct, whatever system's gone. Compare that to this one, delete age discovery, right? Well, in many environments, so to understand this one more clearly, let's go over to discovery methods. So we have a number of discovery methods. This one is the only one that we have to have on. The others are optional. Many environments will use Active Directory system discovery. In my case, it's disabled, but many environments use it. Active Directory system discovery does exactly what the name implies. It will go into Active Directory. It will discover systems that are in Active Directory based on the detail you've asked us to look for, and report that as a discovery record to ConfigMgr, and we'll add it in. Well, here's the challenge. If you have an Active Directory environment where there are machines that are still in AD that have not been logged on or active or whatever for a long period of time, basically AD is not well maintained, then we have the potential to discover that system over and over and over again. So a scenario very, very realistically could exist where a machine's been off the network, out of the environment for a year or more, but we're actively discovering it because it's still in AD. Well, if we are actively discovering it, if there's at least one discovery record that's active for the machine, that maintenance task, delete age discovery, will not delete that machine because one of the discovery methods that we have has discovered it. Whereas delete inactive triggers off of just heartbeat or the other little indicators there, right? Policy and such. For that reason, I prefer inactive as the final judge of when to get rid of a machine, right? But knowing that how we might be kind of hobbled if we're discovering old information from AD, ConfigMgr 2012 gives you some additional options in AD discovery that you can use to decide, do I discover this machine? Yeah, it may be in AD, but if it hasn't logged on in the past 90 days by default, and I like to shorten this, whatever makes sense in your environment, but if it's not been alive for 3 months, it's probably a defunct machine, or hasn't changed its password in 90 days. I like to shorten this too, right? You can go down to a minimum of 30 days there. Then don't even discover it. We'll run AD discovery. We'll see the machine. We just won't discover it, right? Which is helpful. Then we give you another threshold. So I mentioned that in the whole world of trying to figure out active, inactive, right? It's helpful to know whether that machine has been actively logging on to AD, and if it has, but it's inactive in ConfigMgr, maybe it's just a broken client, right? Well, how do you do that? Well, one of the things you can do is you can add an attribute from AD Discovery that will tell you the last time a system is logged on, right? And there's other attributes. You can add custom attributes, whatever. And then you can factor that attribute in when looking at a machine to understand, has this been active? Has it been logging on to AD versus maybe it's been inactive, even logging in for a long period of time, right? So you can kind of understand what's going on in the environment. All right. So that's the first threshold, whether we actually have active or inactive systems in the database or not, whether we allow them in, whether we maintain them out, that kind of thing, right? Certainly, you can build your collections, and I would recommend building your collections to exclude inactive systems from targeting, right? If you target a collection that has inactive systems or defunct systems in it, then your compliance numbers are going to immediately be suppressed by the percentage that represents the number of inactive machines or defunct machines in your collection. So if you had a collection of 50 machines and 10 of them were inactive, you would never ever hope to get above 80% compliance for deployments targeted to that collection, software update deployments targeted to that collection, because 10 of those machines won't ever be able to do anything with them, right? We'll target them, yes, and we'll wait for results for them, yes, but we're never going to get any results back because they're inactive and may be gone from the environment, right? So there's two levers to pull. First is maintaining the environment so that we minimize inactive machines. The other is to avoid targeting inactive machines. And then the discussion there comes up sometimes, well, if we don't target inactive machines, isn't that artificially suppressing the results? You could argue that way, but that's where maintenance comes in, is really important. If you have an inactive machine that's maybe a broken client, you manage that and you fix it. It will then become active. It will then join that collection based on the criteria for the collection, and it will be subject to the deployment, right? So, again, every environment has to decide how to do this, but I'm trying to highlight some of the challenges of this, right? So, one thought could be, and I agree with this thought, to simply just filter out the inactives, and that way your compliance numbers aren't affected. Well, that is a good thought, and for reporting that's true, but that's not true in other ways that we surface up compliance, as you'll see in a little bit, right? Okay. So let me pull the environment back out and move on. Okay, so now what I want to do is spend a little bit of time looking at the sources of compliance data. Where do we have compliance data that we can look at? Well, there's a few places in the console that you can look at for compliance data. It's in some of the customers I've worked with, it's not an abnormal thing to look in the console for compliance data. It's not a bad thing to look in the console for compliance data. The challenge is understanding what specifically you're looking at, right? So the first place I want to do is start under the software updates node. Okay. I'm sorry, I pulled the wrong thing in. So I want to start in the software updates node. Bring the environment back in. There we go. And look what we have. So if we go under software library, look under software updates, this is where I'll see, it's pretty old hat to anyone who's done software update deployment, we'll see a list of all the software updates that are in the environment that I can deploy, right? In this list, what I'm going to see is the number of systems that require this update, the ones that don't require it, the ones where it's installed, and the percent compliance for the environment, right? Notice what I said. For the environment. Why is that important, right? So one thing to notice here is as I'm looking at my results, it is showing me in every case the results for 3 systems. Well, that's interesting. Why? Because if I go over to Assets and Compliance and look at my devices, I have 3 systems. Now, in my case, they're all active. Even if they're inactive, it would still factor them in, right? So immediately, if you have inactive systems in your environment, we're looking at the environment as a whole. There is no collection filtering here, right? On purpose. So your percent compliance for a given update will be for the entire environment. So if you have inactive systems, you're immediately going to skew this number, which is why managing the environment is so important, right? Now, why should we use this node? What is this node for? Right? Well, among other things, it's to be able to see the updates that are required in the environment. I'll come back to that one in a minute. Be able to filter your updates and build software update groups and so on, right? Which is common practice. Being able to spot check individual update results. So assuming you're maintaining your environment, the compliance number here should be in line, generally speaking, with what you would expect it to be, right? Because we're not having a lot of inactive systems. Might not be as in line as a collection that doesn't have inactive systems, but still, it should be fairly close. A lot better than if you maintain a lot of inactive systems, right? Little side note. Here's the challenge. I've seen some customers will give the console to their management, their CIOs, their whoever. Okay, if the CIOs want the console, they can certainly have it. But one of the challenges comes in that maybe they're not understanding what they're looking at, right? This is a console that allows you to administer the environment, make deployments, make decisions, things like that. These numbers here are not really intended for reporting, right? Because of some of the impact that can be seen with inactive systems and so on. So if you're having lower numbers here, it could cause alarm to someone who really doesn't know what they're looking at, right? More on that in a minute. Okay, here's another comment. So one of the things that I will see sometimes folks do is look here and determine if a given update is required. So maybe you do a Patch Tuesday sync, you go in and out of the 10 updates, only 5 of them show as being required by systems in your environment. So instead of deploying all 10, the decision is made to deploy 5 of the 10 because those are the only ones required in the environment. I get it, makes sense, on one level. But here's the rub. If that's the approach you take, and only 5 of the 10 are deployed because that's what's required today, what's to say that one of the other 5 might not be required tomorrow? Right? If you don't deploy it, then it won't be in the environment to be put on those machines that might need it should a condition happen where maybe they don't need it today, but they do need it tomorrow. Right? So again, every organization has to determine how to go about doing things like that, but at least understand what you're doing and eliminating whenever you make that choice. Right? Okay. So now, in terms of populating this list, right, this list is populated by a SQL query very easily. If you just click on all software updates, there's a SQL query running behind the background that's populating this list. Right? It's informative to understand what that SQL query is. So let me pull the environment out and show you. This is the SQL query that's running to populate that node. I highlight this just to show a few things. First of all, I put in yellow the fields that will track, this is not as user-friendly as in the console, but how many systems are missing a given update? How many systems are not applicable for that update? How many systems have that update present? What's the total number of systems? How many systems we don't know about what their state is, right? And what's the percent compliance overall? Well, another thing to show from this collection, so I mentioned this is a look into the environment as a whole. You notice in this query, there is no collection filtering. None, right? It's the whole environment for the update, right? Or the updates. Okay. All right, cool. So let's continue. So what else do we have in terms of places in the console where we might reflect compliance? Okay, well, let's look down. So now we have the software update groups, right? Very common to group software updates together, deploy them as a whole out to the environment. No problem, right? Here's another thing to understand here. You're going to see compliance, percent compliant. This number is for the entire environment. It is not for the collections you've built for targeting, right? Certainly you'll see that we have a deployment down here. Here. We have a deployment. It's down to a collection. I'll get back to that in a minute. But the summary data that we have is reflecting 3 machines. 2 compliant, 1 non-compliant. If you remember, I showed you that I have 3 machines in my environment, right? It's showing the all up for all of the machines. However, if I look at my deployment, it's targeting this test collection. Well, if I go to test collection and look, it's only got 2 members. So only these 2 machines would ever be possibly able to get this deployment. So my environment compliance is 66%, but my targeted compliance is 100%. Again, understanding what these numbers mean will help you be able to paint the right picture. And this also underscores why it's important to manage the inactive systems in your environment. If you have a bunch of inactive or defunct systems, it's going to drive this number to be a lot different potentially than the actual deployed compliance number, right? Okay, so like the software updates node, we use this node to monitor deployment trending for a group. You would want to see this deployment trending get better and better as you have the deployment in the environment longer and longer. You use this node to manage your update group membership, to do maintenance on your update groups, right? We're not using this node as a substitute for reporting. We're not using it to look at up-to-date or authoritative compliance numbers, right? Okay, so I've mentioned a couple of times that we don't use the console nodes here under software updates. This is an all-up environment-specific view, right? We don't filter by collection and deployment here. There's a really good blog article that kind of walks through some of the differences with software updates, some of the discussions, some scenario-based stuff with software updates in 2012. It covers one of these items pretty well. It's actually an inference, so I'm going to go search this. You can see the blog link here, the title. But if you search for this phrase, right? So this kind of validates what I've been saying. It's a different discussion, but notice this. Will be shown, so the compliance, aggregated compliance will be shown for all systems in the console, or you can break it down by collection with reports. So that underscores what I'm saying. In the console, we do not break it down by collection, the compliance. It is an all-up view. And you see that in my environment. If you want to see by collection, which you probably do because that's what you're targeting for the deployment, you need to break it down with the reporting, right? Okay. All right. And so whenever you look at the results for a software update group, right, it's done by query as well. And so if I pull the environment back out and look at this, this is the query. And it's very similar to what we just saw, except here we're sorting specifically by updates that are part of this update group, right? Here's the ID for the update group, okay? So not every update, just those that are part of the update group. Okay. Now, so what else do we have here? So one other thing before I leave this. Actually, I'll talk about both together. So you see, I'm going to talk about this process known as summarization, right? So one of the other things to understand about this. So these software update groups, if you look at them, they're just, there's nothing special about them. All these are containers that contain software update groups, right? If you look at a software update group, you'll see the members inside this are the individual software updates. Here I have one. So if you think about software updates, it's pretty easy to understand that a software update itself in the configuration environment is this thing called a configuration item. Configuration items have to go down to machines, be evaluated. They're either compliant, not compliant, they're installed, whatever. Well, just like software updates themselves are configuration items, software update groups are also configuration items. Meaning that whenever you create a software update group and add updates to that group, you are defining what that software update group looks like. And that definition is what we use to do our compliance calculations, right? Well, if you do routine maintenance, which you should be doing, you're going to be removing updates from the group, adding updates maybe to the group, whatever. When you do that, you're fundamentally changing the definition of that update group. So what does that mean? That means we have to go back and recalculate the percentage compliance of that update group, right? Because now it's changed. The indicators, the rules have changed. We've got to go figure those rules out again. So it's not uncommon that you'll see the the compliance results, overall compliance, drop and then come back over a couple of days, right? It may come back to what it was, maybe better than what it was, maybe a little bit less than what it was, right? But it will be in flux, which is another reason that this might be something that's not understood by folks looking at the console that aren't really familiar with ConfigMgr that much, right? Okay. Another thing that will impact how often you see software update compliance be updated and that kind of thing is this process called summarization. So we don't have real-time data constantly changing in the console. It would be a bit of a nightmare and performance hog and things like that. The way we show you updated detail about the software updates in the environment in the console is this thing called summarization. So by default, it's set to run hourly, right? That's typically okay for most environments, but understand that you can configure it, right? And it affects what you see in this node. Right? So there is a process that runs every time summarization triggers. It's this stored procedure. Well, if you look up this stored procedure on the web, you'll see that there's a discussion about that in some cases this stored procedure is fairly processor intensive, and that's true, right? If this is something that you notice is taking a lot of processing time on your SQL server, it may be something that you want to adjust and not run summarization so frequently. But understand, just like anything, there's an impact to making these adjustments, right? So if you adjust the summarization interval, then you have to understand that it will potentially slow down how often, or it will slow down how up-to-date your console results are, and it can have impacts for some of the reports as well. Typically don't mess with this unless you have a problem, and then just be very judicious about what you do about it, right? Okay. So moving out of the console, well, moving to a different part of the console, we have the monitoring node, right? Monitoring node is where we will monitor ongoing deployments for software updates. So let's go look at this one. So if I go to monitoring, let me pull down a little bit and look at my deployments right here. So I have my deployment specifically here. Well, the first thing that you notice, or one of the first things you notice, is that here we are reflecting the deployment to the collection, and we show 100%. So you saw in the other node that it only showed 66% because it was seeing it for 3 machines. Here we are factoring in only the 2 machines that are in the collection, and so our numbers here are collection filtered. This is a good place to go to be able to track things in the console by collection, right? So what I use this node for is certainly being able to track the deployment progress specifically to your collection of machines, do any kind of deployment troubleshooting. In here, all of my machines are active, but if you have inactive machines, you can come in here. You can certainly see in unknown any machines that are in this category. Unknown fairly simply means that we've got these machines in our collection. We're deploying to them. Deployments are out there. But we don't have any idea whether these machines have got the deployment. We haven't gotten any information back from them, whatever. And we'll group up the machines in certain categories to help you kind of ferret out, is this truly inactive? If it's an old machine that should be gone from the environment, those kind of things, right? So take a look here if you haven't. It's not this is not really a substitute for reporting, right? Though it's a cleaner view for the admin and more focused view because it factors in the collection. There's other things here. This is not just software update deployments, it's deployments as a whole. So it could be potentially confusing. Again, the reports for software updates are the source for compliance reporting for software updates, right? Okay. So like any node, whenever you click on this deployment monitoring node, there's a SQL query that's run behind the scenes to go pull it up. So this is that SQL query, very similar to what you saw, except notice Here we have different types of data. You'll have the collection name, right? Because we're associating it, whether it's compliant, the machine, the last enforcement message, things like that. And notice down here, the assignment ID. So this is associating for sure with a collection, right? Okay, so that's the console in terms of what bubbles up in the console. So I mentioned that reporting is what we should use for understanding our reporting environment, right? Or for presenting compliance and everything. There's a lot of good reports that will help you with presenting the results of software updates, right? There's one category, I put it at the bottom here, I'll talk about it first, called client status. Let me pull in the console again. So there's a whole series of reports. So I've mentioned how important it is to make sure your environment is clean. Keeping a tab on inactive clients, understanding what's going on in your environment related to inactive clients and so on. You can do that through the console. A number of ways, right? But there's another way here where you can look at inactive clients in this report and get the details about them. Well, I don't have any, so this report would come back blank for me. But if you have inactive clients, it'll give you the detail around last time we've talked to these clients and different other things, right? So use it, right? Look at your summary of your clients. Make sure that we're healthy, that kind of thing. It's good stuff. There's another series of reports here specifically for software updates that we'll talk about, right? So let's go down there. So first we'll start with the compliance, right? So there's a number of categories. So what you see here, these compliance reports are specifically designed to present compliance data from ConfigMgr software updates, right? All of these reports, the only exception being Compliance 5, factor in a collection when presenting the results, right? So Compliance 5 doesn't because it's looking at a specific computer, which is different and fine, but it will absolutely factor in the collection. This should be the source for reporting compliance data from ConfigMgr. There's other categories here. There's deployment management. All of these reports would be those that show the detail needed to help plan and deal with deployments. So you'll have deployments of an update group. You'll see updates in a deployment. You'll see computers missing content. Those kinds of things. So being able to manage and deal with software update management ongoing. That's what these are for. Okay. Then we have deployment state. So deployment state. Sometimes I will see this group being used to present compliance data. This group is not intended for compliance data. This deployment states group is intended to show you the various deployment states that are out there, right? This is information about the evaluation and enforcement states on client computers for software updates. One of the interesting reports here will show you all of the available states that might be possible for a software update deployment. So I'll just fill in the blanks here. We'll look at it. Okay. So this represents all of the values that are possible in this report, right? So this shows you, we have values here that should represent the progress of software update deployment, right? Installing or is installed or downloading or failed or whatever, right? Those are all here. So one of the things that I've seen historically, and I don't see it in this list, is wondering why you don't have a compliance status here. Well, it's because we don't intend to show you that. We're showing you progress along the way. There is no compliant state result, right? So don't use this for compliance. Use the compliant results for compliance. Use these to understand the tracking, how things are running in your environment. And kind of alongside that, side by side with that, though you see the full list of potential states, you may not actually see all of those states. So there is a toggle that we have on our deployments that allow you to decide how much granularity you want with your state. By default, it's set to only success and error messages, which will exclude some of those message types, right? You can, and the reason that's there is to just avoid some of the noise of state messages coming up. Or you can choose to go back and get all of them like we had in 2007, right? Or only error messages. Totally up to you. This toggle's there. It's set for only success and error messages by default. All right. Okay, so let's go back. So then we have another category of reports called scan. and kind of troubleshooting goes hand in hand with this. Um, if we look at this, this will give us good detail about scan results and what we've seen in the environment. If we look at this one, it'll show us all of the different scan states that are possible, right? So it's good for troubleshooting. This one is also good for troubleshooting. And my tendency is to just bypass these reports and go troubleshoot directly. It's up to you. But these reports are here, provide useful information, so take a look. Right? So the last thing I want to do really quickly, just because it's good to highlight it, is talk about deployment monitoring tool. It's one of the tools in the R2 toolkit, or at least before that. It's in the R2 toolkit for sure. That can be used to give you information about deployments. This is not just for software updates. You can get properties of the machine that you are targeting. You can certainly connect to a remote machine. You can see all of your deployments and the current state, what type they are, right? And then you can see detail about all of the updates on a given client system. So if you want to be able to connect across the network, grab this kind of detail without sifting through logs and WMI and that kind of thing, it's a useful tool to do that. The only unfortunate thing that I've seen about this is you can't really sort by these columns, right? It is what it is. But it's useful, right? It's a good tool to have and useful, so I thought I'd show it to you. So that kind of wraps up the discussion that I wanted to have related to monitoring. Monitoring is a crucial piece for software updates and will impact the compliance results that you have, as we've talked about. So hopefully that helps. There is an intention to do one more in the software update series for automation, but we'll wrap this session for now, and we will see you next time.